Hey, what's good with y'all, man? It's been a minute, but who's like got us back with another video. We're gonna go deep into some theological stuff. We're gonna be talking about the destruction of the temple from a Christian perspective. We're just gonna analyze and dig into these things a little bit. So if you're cool with that, then stick to the end because we're gonna cover some really interesting territory stuff you probably haven't heard too much on Sunday service. So we're gonna start right here. The temple. If you know the Bible a little bit, you probably heard of the temple. The temple is basically the central place of worship for God in the Old Testament and even in the New Testament. See, the temple was standing for most of the New Testament, and this was the main place where people will come and worship God in Jerusalem. So we have this central place for worship, but here's the thing. It was destroyed twice in the Bible. Did you know that? The first time after Israel, because of their sin and their idolatry, but the second time it was destroyed 40 years after Christ was crucified. So 4 decades after Christ, the temple was destroyed a second time, never to be rebuilt again to this day. So we're going to be unpacking the significance of this from a biblical and even Talmudic perspective, just to throw a little bit of the rabbi's writings in here. Not that I adhere to them, but to just show and make this a little bit interesting from multiple perspectives. These markers is mad messed up, bro. Y'all can't see that. I'm gonna give a zoom in real quick. Just peep this out, y'all. We have, let's step back 2,000 years, right? We have the crucifixion, darkness, when the Messiah was crucified. And then we have this 40-year window where the early Christian church coincided with the Levitical priesthood and the priests in Jerusalem. But 40 years after Christ was killed, the temple was destroyed, never to be rebuilt. And most of the New Testament was written actually within this 40-year window. The window while the temple still stood in Jerusalem, the apostles and early disciples keeping the feast and doing these things is when the New Testament is contextualized within. So we're going to be unpacking all of that. And saying when the temple was finally destroyed, and even this window of time leading up to it, why was that so significant? I'm going to dive right in. So let's just get this framework on the board. And reason number one, let me pull up. Reason number one why this is so significant. Prophetic. The window in which the followers of Jesus, the Christ followers, who proclaiming the Messiah, and the temple standing, and the Levitical priesthood doing their thing is actually very prophetic. So for this, I got to bring you to Malachi chapter 3. Now, if you know the Old Testament a little bit, Malachi was a prophet sent to the post-exilic generation. I told you earlier about how early Israelites were idolatrous, foreign gods. So God punished them. They're taken away to Babylon. Then eventually they returned. They rebuilt the temple. There is a series of prophets that God sent to them. Malachi was one of them. So Malachi, one of the things he actually does is condemn the priesthood because they were sort of half-hearted and corrupt in the way they were operating. And this is, from the Talmud, rabbinic sources, something that seems to even be continued into Jesus' day in terms of how the priests would act, even getting compared to the sons of Eli. Which in the Old Testament, these sons of Eli would sleep with women, sex up women right outside of the tabernacle of God. Very disrespectful. So it's not a good comparison. So we can see that from Malachi's day even to Jesus, the priests were lacking. And God calls them out. In Malachi, and you could say when Jesus gets on the scene, this is sort of like a fulfillment to that. So let's dive right in. All right, Malachi chapter 3. Start at verse 1. Behold, I send my messenger, and he will prepare the way before me. And the Lord whom you seek will suddenly come to his temple. And the messenger of the covenant in whom you delight, behold, he is coming, says the Lord of hosts. But who can endure the day of his coming, and who can stand when he appears? For he will be like a refiner's fire and like a fuller's soap. He will sit as a refiner and purifier of silver, and he will purify the sons of Levi and refine them like gold and silver, and they will bring offerings in righteousness to the Lord. Then verse 4 goes on to say, Then the offering of Judah and Jerusalem will be pleasing to the Lord as in the days of old and as in former years. Right before the priesthood was all corrupt and stuff like this. So this prophecy is interesting for a couple of reasons. Number one, we're talking about the temple here, and it's a physical temple because God calls out the priesthood. And the most natural meaning, when you understand who Malachi is speaking to, is the second temple, meaning the temple that stood from the generation of exiles that returned to the year 70 when it was finally destroyed. This huge chunk of time where this rebuilt temple stood. And the interesting thing is the Lord promises that the Lord will suddenly come to the temple. Now, who is this talking about? Well, you could put together in the Old Testament that God and the Messiah are intrinsically connected. But apart from that, this Lord who arrives will have both a messenger before him, and as a result of his arrival, he will have a restoration of the Levitical priesthood. Now, this is interesting because a lot of times even Christians go to this passage, they miss the Levitical part, or they think that it's something far off. But this is something that is effects that we can see that were going on in Jesus' day that most people miss. All right, so let me bring you to Acts chapter 7. Acts chapter 6, verse 10, excuse me. And what does Luke say? Verse 7, And the word of God continued to increase, and the number of the disciples multiplied greatly in Jerusalem, and a great many of the priests became obedient to the faith. Now, one quick thing to understand, it's important to understand the apostles were not trying to start a new religion. Right? Sometimes we look at Judaism and Christianity as two different things, but that's our modern eyes looking back on ancient people. The minds of the apostles is very clear from their own writings and things like that. They were not trying to start a new religion or get rid of or overthrow the religion of their forefathers, or so to speak, but they saw Jesus as fulfilling the scriptures of their ancestors, and Jesus as being the Messiah of the God of their ancestors' plan to bring salvation and things like that. So they saw themselves in a new era, but they saw this connected to prophecy hundreds of years old. So they are proclaiming the Messiah, and they saw these things being fulfilled, and that they were witnesses to age-old things coming to realization. Just want to put that in there. So as a result of this, we see many priests became obedient to the faith. In other words, a lot of the Levitical priests who were serving at the temple actually came to believe that Yeshua was the Messiah of the scriptures. So that's something really interesting, just to throw that little rabbit hole in there. So we know, and we believe as Christians, that the Israelite sacrificial system, especially if you actually really examine it in the culture and the time, was ultimately pointing to Christ. Because even in the Old Testament, you have Isaiah 53, which bare bones describes the suffering servant who, as a result of his suffering, will make an atonement for both Israel and the nations. Now, the interesting thing is that if you look through history, through the Old Testament and the intertestamental period, meaning the time between the Old Testament and the New Testament, we could see God clearly preserve the priesthood, and the legitimate priests who have the right to work in the temple always had a legitimate temple to worship Yahweh in, or Yahweh in. You know what I'm saying? So the legitimate priests we can see throughout history are preserved. So how fitting that when we get to Jesus and at the preaching of the apostles, that a remnant of the priesthood, in light of all this corruption in Malachi's day, in light of all this corruption in Jesus' day, would actually come to believe in the Messiah of the scriptures and the one whom God vindicated by the resurrection. Another thing to note is that the priests were just normal people. Most of the time, most of the year, they had other jobs to sustain themselves, but 2 weeks in a year, they would go to the temple and do what they had to do. So it's logical to think that during this time, doing what they were required to by the law and by what God had instructed, as they were doing their duties in the temple, they had this understanding that the one whom God vindicated by the resurrection, has come and actually fulfilled these things. He's the greater form of these sacrifices, which many sins in the Old Testament didn't even have a sacrifice to atone for them, yet Jesus' sacrifice atones for it all. So that's a cool thing, the prophetic significance Also, Jesus was teaching in the temple for the last week of his life. And the things he was teaching was Israelites how to rightly keep the law, the most important commandments in the Torah, and how to follow God in with the right heart, not just legalistic tradition and the motions, so having a heart for God. So it's interesting to think that if we look at Jesus' teachings when he was in the temple, how that may have had a positive effect on the Levites in their own relationship with God, getting out of the motions but just genuinely seeking him. So that's number one, the prophetic significance of the restoration of the priesthood, which again would need to happen before the year 70. So Malachi 3 gives us three elements to the Lord who will suddenly come to the temple, which matches Jesus to a T and what happened with the priests, and also the messenger that came before him, John the Baptist. Now here's where things start to get a little bit juicy. The second reason of the significance of not only this 40-year time period of the early Christian movement, which just means followers of Christ, followers of Messiah, and the final destruction of the temple, is judgment. Now, in the year 70, the Jerusalem temple was completely destroyed, and the priesthood was forever destroyed as well. Here's an interesting thing, though. All potential for Jewish sacrifices were forcibly stopped, but not just in Jerusalem. There was also an Egyptian temple dedicated to Yahweh in Egypt that was standing for a long time, and that was destroyed as well 3 years later. Most people don't even know that this temple, called the Temple of Onias, even existed, y'all, but for a little while there were two temples to God, the one in Jerusalem and the one in Egypt, and both of them got destroyed within the same window of time, which shows that judgment, this is clearly God's judgment which came on the nation. This is something that everybody agrees on. The Jews who were going through it at the time, the Israelites, as we can see from Josephus, but even in the Talmud, they recognize that this is judgment. The reason they believe it is because of baseless hatred that was going on among Jews at the time. But is that all that was at play, or was there another reason why a judgment of this magnitude, all potential for Jewish sacrifice being forcefully stopped forever, to this day, no standing temple, no standing priesthood? Could there be a deeper reason for this? Could it be linked to Israel's rejection of the Messiah? Well, let's peep it out. Let's go through a couple of different theories. Number one, the first temple was destroyed because of idolatry. Now, you can't say that was the case in this case because, number one, Jesus renounced idolatry in his teachings. But what the apostles came to believe about Jesus, that he was this Son of Man of Daniel 7, they came to believe by his resurrection. So it's not that they were making it up, and most scholars and historians who actually study will agree that the empty tomb is historical and that the apostles genuinely believed these things. So by the belief in the resurrection, which they made a total 180 on, they saw him as fitting both cultural and biblical frameworks, prophecies, and visions that God presents for the Messiah. Right, as far as the divine Messiah goes, that was found in ancient Judaism, even though it's not a concept you find now. But the point is, what they came to believe about Jesus fit both cultural and biblical frameworks, as ancient Hebrews and the text at face value says. Right, but even if I discard that, even if I give you that Jesus was an idol, the priests and the Levites, the religious leaders, would have actually been right to reject him. They would have been right to reject Jesus or Yeshua if he was false, and yet their temple was destroyed, and even the temple in Egypt was destroyed. So as a result of this rejection and killing of Jesus, this great magnitude judgment fell on all Israelites and worshippers of God, that the temples honored to his name were destroyed. So what you can't say is that they were destroyed because of the followers of Jesus or because Jesus was a false prophet. You can't say that. So what are we left with? Well, the traditional rabbinic understanding is that a lot of the hatred going on was the reason. No, I'm not going to even say that hatred didn't play a role at all, because we know God really cares about the heart. But let's go into the book of Luke. The New Testament, Jesus claims very clearly that these things will happen in the future. Jesus is actively making predictions that these things will happen because they did not realize the time of their visitation. Let me bring you to Luke 19. Jesus says, Luke 19, verses 42 to 44, Jesus says, "Would that you, even you, had known on this day the things that make for peace, but now they are hidden from your eyes. For the days will come upon you when your enemies will set up a barricade around you and surround you and hem you in on every side and tear you down to the ground, you and your children within you. And they will not leave one stone upon another in you, because you did not know the time of your visitation." So, about 4 decades after Jesus would have originally said these things, the Romans came, barricaded Jerusalem, destroyed, ransacked the temple, the holy things, and destroyed it completely. And as a result, the priesthood was gone for good, and Israelites can no longer make offerings, meat offerings, drink offerings to God. The same thing will later happen to the Egyptian temple. So the New Testament directly claims the reason this happened was because Israel rejected the Messiah. Now, here's the interesting thing is that there's a lot of weight to this. If we actually look at the Messianic expectation in Jesus' day was extremely high, because there are certain passages that imply that the arrival of the Messiah would be at hand in their day. So Jews in that time understood these passages at face value, such as Daniel 9, such as Malachi 3, Haggai 2, and Genesis 49:10. The way these were interpreted by ancient Israelites, and just taking these passages at face value, like Daniel 2, Daniel 9, the Messianic window implied to come during the days of Rome. So if we look at these scriptures, they seem to lay a foundation for when God would enter into history and set up the kingdom for his own name. When we have this going right in Jesus' day, now things get a little bit interesting, because the temple was destroyed. Clearly God sent judgment on the Israelites, but why was it? Was it just because of hatred, or was it because the Messiah, whom God had vindicated by the resurrection, that he was in their midst, and yet the majority of that generation had rejected him? And that's why God brought this judgment on that generation to make this known. Now, ancient Jews who were actually going through this saw this as judgment, from the God of their ancestors. And when you put this in light of the darkness at the crucifixion, now it gets very interesting, because we have various things going on that would have been interpreted as omens and as signs and as judgments by the people at that time. I think that's interesting, how the crucifixion darkness, which is pretty historically supported, that, there's a reason why the Romans said this is the son of the gods, and then 40 years later, the temple being destroyed, Jews realizing this is judgment. The fact that these things all happen sequentially is very, very interesting. So, yeah, man, both these things align with Daniel 9:26, which has clearly messianic elements. Daniel 9 has concretely messianic elements, if nothing else. Then ancient Israelites picked up on this, like the Jews in the Qumran community, right? So people looked at the 70 weeks prophecy and saw the Messiah coming in their day because of it. So we look at Daniel 9:26. We have this anointed one who is cut off, and later the temple is destroyed. So this anointed one is cut off from the community. The temple is later destroyed. Jesus is crucified without deserving it. 40 years later, the temple is destroyed. Another interesting thing, Jesus was literally anointed with oil before he died. So we do have a literal anointed one who suffered unjustly before the temple was destroyed. All of these things match the description. You want to go back to Isaiah 53, the one who suffers without deserving it. A lot of evidence we have actually shows, I would argue, that Jesus suffered without deserving it, right? He wasn't one who was suffering for his own condemnation. See, check it out. The four Gospels each report this, but even if you want to go out beyond that, we know this is something that the early church and the apostles genuinely believed, right? Because a lot of the traditions and things in the New Testament go back to within 5 years of the death and resurrection, as most scholars would point out. So within the very start of the church, we have the doctrine that Jesus died and resurrected according to the scriptures. And within that death is a death that was not deserved or was taken on him for the sins of others. So this tradition, this belief is something that goes back to the very early church. So now if we have that, we have this candidate for Isaiah 53, at least just to believe that they believed this, who died and resurrected. He wasn't going for his own sins, and as a result, God vindicated him. And we have to look at what happened. As a result of things like Daniel 2, Daniel 9, the timing of God's kingdom, which ancient Jews picked up on top of the one who suffers without deserving it. Then we go back to Isaiah 53, Isaiah 52:15, and we realize that as a result of this servant's suffering, other nations and kings who have not heard about it will come to realize it, and as a backhanded effect, they will come to faith in the God of Israel. World history attests to that. Even if you don't accept a single page of the New Testament, kings and millions all around the world have come to believe in the God of Israel. People who never had the Hebrew Bible, people who never had the prophet Isaiah, have come to believe in the same God because of Jesus, because of the Messiah that the apostles were preaching. Now, this is something that this is just I'm saying, examine history. Look at the prophecy and examine history, even if you don't take one word of the New Testament. I think that's pretty interesting. So my point is, look at the effect Jesus had. Look at how what is written about him and what the apostles and followers of him genuinely believed matched the prophetic picture. But even beyond that, the prophetic picture saying the effect that this will have on the world objectively matches what happened in the world because of Jesus. All with the understanding that the timing of God's kingdom aligns in this window, and also understanding that the apostles weren't trying to start a new religion. Putting all these things together, it becomes very interesting, and we can see that, well, everybody agrees God is putting judgment on the Israelites, something of great magnitude because both temples were destroyed. We can look and see the most cohesive argument for the reason all this happened is because Israelites mainstream rejected Jesus as the Messiah, and as a result, God is bringing judgment on the generation. Now, if you think that's lame, I'm going to give you one last final thing, and I think it's going to be very interesting. And that is the Jonah parallel. Just think about what I said in number 2. Right, the temple was destroyed. There was judgment. It seems like God was judging the people because of the rejection of Jesus, who basically, as I'm trying to show, has this great track record for him. But after that, take this evidence as well, because this is what makes it really interesting. During his ministry, Jesus or Yeshua cited the prophet Jonah as one definite sign to the Pharisees that he was the Messiah, that he really was from God. This is what he said in Matthew 12, verse 38. Some of the scribes and Pharisees answered him, saying, "Teacher, we wish to see a sign from you." But he answered them, "An evil and adulterous generation seeks for a sign, but no sign will be given to it except the sign of the prophet Jonah. For as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the great fish, so will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth." Now here's what's interesting. If you actually go to the book of Jonah in the Old Testament and examine it, we already see Jesus citing him as a parallel. When we actually look at Jonah's story, it becomes very, very interesting. Now check it. We got Jonah. He was sent to a pagan city of Nineveh. And long story short, it became very clear the message was that if you do not repent within 40 days, God's time frame of 40 days, he will bring judgment and destruction to the city. Now, compared to Christ's situation, Jonah was sent to Nineveh, Christ was sent to Jerusalem. When he was killed, AD 30 or AD 33, he was rejected. And as a result, 40 years later, divine judgment fell on Jerusalem, something that everybody agrees on, even if we don't agree with the reason why. See? So Jonah came, they listened to his message, they actually repented, and so they didn't face the judgment that God had planned for them. When we get to Jesus, who was rejected, a man who claimed to be the Messiah, this great judgment befell not only Jerusalem, but the temple in Egypt 40 years after the crucifixion. So it's just a crazy dynamic that the judgment on the city in Jonah's day was 40 days. 40 years after Christ, the people that actually rejected his message got the judgment. You know what I'm saying? And now Jesus was either crucified in AD 30 or AD 33. Some scholars, disagree about the exact date. But either you have 40 years or 37 years. right, to get from the year 30 to 33 to 70. But 37 is still a round figure of 40. And I'm just going and saying that this is interesting. You know what I'm saying? And 40 in the Bible is already significant symbolic number. So just the fact that we have this 40-year period of round figure, that judgment came after the rejection of one who was greater than Jonah, that's wild. So, and here's another thing too, that the destruction of the temple is never even mentioned in the Bible. It's something that Jesus predicts, but the New Testament never actually records. You have to look in the history books, or better yet, a Google search to actually look and see that, this judgment happened on Jerusalem in the 1st century, and we're left to wonder why. As Christ said, the men of Nineveh will rise up at the judgment with this generation and condemn it, for they repented at the preaching of Jonah, and behold, something greater than Jonah is here. Matthew 12:41. So all in all, this is just examining some interesting things about the period between the Messiah's ascension, right, when he resurrected and eventually ascended into heaven to be at the right hand of God, and the temple's destruction. The period between these things was 40 years, and we examine why this period was so significant and why the destruction itself was so significant. There's the prophetic reason with the remnant of the priesthood that did come to do their duties and their offerings with a renewed sense of worship and heart for God. There was the clear judgment on Israel for whatever sin. So that's another thing that was interesting. It seems like the judgment was because of the rejection of Jesus. At the very least, it wasn't because Jesus was an idol that the nation got judgment. You can't say that. So why did the temple get destroyed? We looked at reason number 3. The same way a prophet was sent to a city, had they rejected the message, they would have been destroyed 40 days. Jesus, a so-called prophet, came to the city. They actually rejected his message. 40 years later, their city was destroyed, and before all this happened, Jesus said he was greater than Jonah. So it's natural that if he is like Jonah, that the judgment and the things that would happen as regards him and his generation would also parallel that of Jonah. So it's cool that we can look and just look at things that aren't even laid out clearly in the Bible and actually see the parallel of these things. So listen, man, this was a little bit of a longer one. I'm going to make some more cultural stuff in the future, like cultural commentary, take a little break. Let me know if you're down for that. And, please hit the subscribe button. I rarely ask, but I think they shadow banned me at this point. But one thing I want to say is that on this channel, I'm all about being objective. So I'm all about finding the evidence where it leads, even if you don't know what to make of it or how to process it. I never ask you to convert right away or to stop believing what you believe, whatever side of the camp you may be on. All I'm doing is, let's look at this evidence and let's just put it in the mind banks, even if we don't know what to do with it. Even if we don't know what to do with it, just take this in light of whatever you believe and just pray to God for truth and for guidance and let him sort these things out. And I hope you do so. So God bless you all. Be blessed in the name of Yeshua HaMashiach. This whole thing with the temple has a lot of significant undertones, and I just wanted to bring out 3 reasons why this is so significant, and 3 reasons that also point to Jesus as the Messiah. Let me know what y'all think in the comments. And God bless. Peace.